Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Mike Winters. I'm a product marketing manager at Garden, and really excited to have you here tonight, where we're going to talk about how we use Garden as part of our own developer workflows on a day-to-day basis. And here's a bit about how we're going to do it. So start off with some introduction here, and then we're going to talk about what it's like to set up and use Garden from the perspective of a DevOps engineer, a Backend engineer, and a Frontend engineer. So we'll have some slides and description and also some demo interspersed throughout. And we're based in Berlin, a city not famous for its home internet speeds and all working from home. And so some of our demos depend on a strong internet connection. So if we have to skip over anything, we'll be sure to record it and put it up on the blog after the fact. And then lastly, we'll have plenty of time set aside for Q&A. And so we had some questions come in during registration, but you can also submit questions throughout the webinar, and we're keeping an eye on those as they come in. So if you look in the Livestorm interface to the right, there's both a chat section and a questions section. So using that questions tab, it's helpful for us just to make sure we don't lose any of your questions in the chat. And so, yeah, drop questions in at any point and we'll get through as many as we can. And if you have any issues with audio or with seeing our screens, just be sure to let us know and we'll jump in and help you out with that. So some quick background about Garden in case you are new to the company. So Garden was founded in 2018. Like I mentioned, we are headquartered in Berlin, but of course we have users and customers all around the globe. And we build a Kubernetes and cloud native testing platform. So we have both an open source core, and we recently announced an enterprise edition just at the end of June. And so I'm going to take one slide to talk about Garden Enterprise, just so you know what it is in case you're not familiar with it. So Garden Enterprise is a unified management layer for Garden. It's built on top of Garden Core, and it includes centralized environment management, secrets and user management, and gives you a way to integrate directly with GitHub and GitLab and a whole lot more. And so in short, I think it's the fastest and easiest way to roll out Garden environments to teams and to do so securely. And so if you have any questions about Garden Enterprise, we're happy to set up time to talk about it with you. And you can go to garden.io. It's a place to reach out to us there. And now on to the really fun stuff. So today's presenters are Eythor and Emanuele from our engineering team. You may recognize their names because they're often in Garden Slack chat, answering questions and helping users. Really the perfect two people to carry us through today's webinar. And I'm actually going to hand it over to them to introduce themselves and say a bit about who they are and what they do. So Eythor, why don't you go first?
Thanks, Mike. Thank you for the introduction. Hi, all. My name is Eythor. I am CTO and co-founder of Garden. So I've been with Garden since day one. And yeah, just really excited to talk to you today about my experience as a Garden user and not just a maintainer. But before I get into that, maybe Emanuele, you want to say a few words?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Emanuele. I joined Garden, I think it's been a year and a half now. My background is mostly a full stack developer. I've done well backend or the frontend, and recently been kind of focusing on developing the Garden Enterprise product. And yeah, looking forward to show you how I work essentially.
Nice, thank you. So yeah, I'll start by talking a little bit about our stack, how we set things up, and some of our workflows. And I'll try and convey kind of what it feels like to work with Garden. So hopefully this will be useful for both those who are familiar with Garden and those that are new to it. And after that, I'll give 3 examples of like some challenges we ourselves have bumped into and how we went about solving those before passing it on to Emanuele, who will actually demo the proper development experience. So I'll kind of set things up and demo. Emanuele will demo it in action. But yeah, we're 6 developers, all working remotely, as is usually the case in this day and age. And we're building 2 products, Garden Core and Garden Enterprise. And we're actually using Garden Core to build Garden Enterprise and vice versa. So there's a lot of dogfooding going on kind of between the 2 products, and yeah, that's what kind of allows me to speak to you today as a heavy user of Garden, both core. We even use Garden Enterprise to dogfood Garden Enterprise, but maybe that's for another webinar. And onto our stack. You'd switch the slide. Yeah, there you go. So we have 3 core services and a handful of supporting services, such as Postgres, Vault, Jaeger for tracing. The core services are written in Node.js, TypeScript, and it's a mono repo, so everything's in the same repo. We use GCP for a development environment and AWS for our staging environment. And the reason we're using both environments is that we just want to try to test Garden out basically into two contexts. So it's kind of part of our dogfooding strategy, so to speak. And all this infrastructure, both GCP and AWS, is provisioned with Terraform. We used to have Terraform and kind of the main code in the same project, all in a single Garden project, but we've since split them up into 2 separate projects. So now it's still in the same repo, but we have 2 projects in the same repo, one for the infrastructure and the other for the code proper. We just felt that fitted our workflows a little bit better. And we use Canico for in-cluster builds. Just started using that actually. Before we used the Docker daemon and in-cluster building, but we found that it was more of a maintenance burden for us. We had to clean up the registry every now and then, and of course, Canico just scales better and is more secure. So that's why I think Docker and the in-cluster registry might be a good choice for small teams, or where like security is not a concern because the Docker daemon can run as root in the cluster. But for larger teams and that need to scale, Canico is probably a better choice. Whereas Docker daemon is a little bit faster for those smaller teams. And an honorable mention is ENTR or enter, which is just a command line utility that we use for hot reloading. It can watch a set of files, and basically, if they change, it can restart a process. So we found that a nifty little tool, especially for hot reloading things that. Such as Go services, where you need to kind of rebuild the binary. And the next slide, please. So yeah, now I just want to move on and talk a little bit about kind of our setup and workflows, kind of from a high level. So we of course use Garden in CI to run tests and deploy to staging. And you'll notice there on the left that that's actually a screen cap of our actual CI or like CI config file. I redacted a little bit, but it shows the gist of it. You notice we're using the Garden Docker image, which means we don't have to install Garden in CI, so it saves us that trouble. But then it's just a matter of running the simple Garden commands, whether it's test or deploying to staging. And from a DevOps perspective, I think like one of the biggest benefits of using Garden is that it codifies my entire stack and makes it super portable across different contexts like this. So, this basically means that, like, you see the Garden deploy command here for the staging environment. It works, on my branch, on my teammate's branch, in CI, and, for the person I'm onboarding, if that's the case. So, as a result, the CI workflow boils down to just these handful of commands, whether it's test or deploy. And I can just as well run these commands from my own machine. It makes it much easier to debug and shell into containers. So, I guess it kind of feels like I've regained control over my CI workloads. And I think this is quite hard to achieve without Garden. And I really don't want to go back to the times of, where you debug an integration test, or like you are debugging an integration test. And to see the changes, you need to push code to GitHub. You need to wait for the CI pipeline to run, and then see if like whatever you're trying to fix worked. So being able to do that from my machine is very powerful, and I think kind of a unique feature of Garden. But I think kind of the underlying point that I'm convey here is just the portability of it all. So once you set things up with Garden, you can run these commands in just about any context. It's trivial to switch to CI or to switching between branches or what have you. So I think that's a really powerful feature. And on to the next slide, please. Right, so each developer has their own namespace and unique host names. So if you look at the configuration to your left, you'll notice we're using the template syntax to give each developer a namespace based on their username, and likewise for host names. You also notice I'm using the merge key here, which is a new feature of Garden, which allows you to merge in a kind of setup or map of config variables from the project level variables into the environment. And I think this really speaks to the developer enablement part of the story. So as a DevOps engineer, I can set up all the supporting services and give each member of the team kind of their own instance. So for example, we just added Diego for tracing, and now all developers, as soon as they pull in from latest master and run a current deploy, they will have their own instance of Diego. I'm going to turn off my webcam. I notice I'm getting like bad connection notifications. If you don't mind, see if that helps. Real quick. But yeah, I was saying, like, being able to, as a DevOps engineer, add these kind of things to our stack, and it just works for my developers. That feels really good. And in a similar way, we just added an Octant provider to Garden Core, which gives you a Kubernetes dashboard embedded in the Garden dashboard. Octant, it's a tool from VMware. It's just basically an open source Kubernetes dashboard that you can now enable with Garden. And I think, yeah, this is like as another example of how a kind of DevOps person can, pull in useful tools for the team and have it work with Garden. And having unique namespaces and host names like this, it also means that it's straightforward to share work and try out the things that others are working on. And this is a core part of our workflows and plays a big part in our review process. So we're like, I'll just send someone a link to, the state of my project that I'm working on, so they could literally like just look into the UI, see what's going on. And this is actually a big, core feature of Garden Enterprise, kind of automating that whole process. And next slide, please. So yeah. So integration test, like kind of still on the topic of developer enablement, but the fact that developers have all the services they need running in their own namespace enables them to write and basically run and debug integration tests across service boundaries with minimum effort. So I think, I mentioned this before when debugging CI pipeline, but being able to debug tests like this without going through the pipeline, again, incredibly powerful. And Emanuele is actually going to show you what that looks like in his demo. But in general, we're big believers in kind of the behavioral driven test, the given, when, then type of testing, such as like functional tests, integration tests, and end-to-end. And with this setup, writing integration tests basically feels like writing functional tests. You're not, even though you're calling kind of, making network calls across the wire, it feels like it's within the same process, really. So I think, using Garden has really changed the way we write tests, and of course to the better, in my opinion. And in fact, I can let me just share my screen real quick. How do I go do that? There you go. Right. So just to show you what I mean, this is I'm here on our dashboard. This is the stack graph for our project. This is the actual stack graph, and this is the integration test for the API service. And you notice here, like, kind of all the things that need to be, that need to happen and need to be up and running for these tests to run successfully. So there's your Postgres, there's Vault, there's Jaeger, and there's just a lot of going on. And kind of as a developer using Garden, I can just assume that these are all up and running, and I can call these as I'm writing my tests. And more importantly, I can do it in my own namespace as I develop, so pre-commit, really. So I think, again, that's just an insanely powerful feature and really changes the way we think about testing in general. Maybe since I'm here, I'll show you the Octant tab as well. So I mentioned we now have an Octant provider, so you can opt into this little page of the dashboard by adding that to your config file, and that gives you this Kubernetes dashboard. You can see you have deployments, pods, and you can view logs and everything. And also mentioned Diego before, just kind of as an example of how easy it is to add things like that to your stack. So we haven't set this up yet. We're just we have actually PR pending for setting the tracing up, but the services are all there, and everyone has their own instance in their own namespace, which is kind of another benefit of having like unique namespaces and host names, and and being, it's trivial for the developer to start using these tools, and only the DevOps person needs to set them up. And yeah, maybe if we just switch back to the slides. Sorry, yeah, I'll probably need to turn off screen sharing. Oh no, okay. Right. So yeah, if you go to the next one, please. Right. So these were kind of from a high level overview our workflows and how we broadly configure things, and just want to also mention like 3 more concrete examples of common challenges that we bumped into as well, and I'm sure maybe other Garden users have thought about. First one is generating migrations. So basically, the solution to this one, as we see, okay, so the problem is that you want to generate some code, whether it's a migration or something else, and this happens in a container in your cluster, but you need it in your source code, and there's no straightforward way to do it with Garden currently. So what we do is we have a single task for generating the migration first, and then a second task, a local exec module, which can run like arbitrary scripts for you, and that copies the task, sorry, the artifact from the artifact.garden/artifacts directory into your source code. So generally, when you copy artifacts, or Garden copies artifacts from a running container, it stores it in the .garden directory, which isn't source controlled. But using this kind of little hack, hack and attack, you call it what you want, you can copy it. We just have a script that copies it from the artifacts directory into source. And at least from a developer's perspective, they just run, Garden run task, add migration, and it should just work. You'll notice it has a dependency on generate migration task, which is the one that actually runs in the container in your cluster and has all the dependencies, can talk to the database and everything like that. So that's kind of we bumped into this ourselves when setting things up, and this I think I would call this our recommended solution for now. We actually want to add a feature for allowing you to copy straight from the artifact directory to kind of a location of your choice, but at the moment you can easily work around it with a local exec module like this. And the next one is sharing code between modules. We have a few questions. We've got a few questions about this on the community Slack and on GitHub, and kind of gone back and forth on this. But for context, so we have a API service and a front service, and we want to share the types from the API with the front end. Now, how do we go about doing that? We used to have a third module called just API types that would run locally, build the API types in the API service or API module, and then we would set up build dependencies, so that got copied into the build context of the front end. But we think now that a better way to do this is to hoist the garden.yaml file for the front end to the top. Have it you can use named Garden config files if you have multiple files in the same directories, which is called frontend.garden.yaml, and you can basically include both the API and the front end, and then in a multi-stage Docker build, you can first generate your API types. You see that kind of the image below is a screenshot from a Docker file with a bunch of stuff redacted actually, but you can generate types in the first step and then copy them from the kind of type builder image, into the main image. So in short, I think the recommended way, at least for a lot of cases, to share code between modules would be to use multi-stage Docker builds as opposed to be messing around with build dependencies, in particular because that doesn't play very well with development. And I think the final thing I want to mention, this is actually super simple, but as I was working on this presentation, I noticed that there's a lot of repetition in our config files, and they weren't all that pretty. So super simple to fix that just by using the merge key that I mentioned earlier, which you can see on the above picture. We have like common db config, just a map of values that we can then merge into the dev environment specifically, and also across files. And we want to add functionality to allow you to merge multiple configs like this. together. So you can merge your common DB config and common something else config, and you can overwrite like a default value below, as you've seen. And the other one is just use YAML anchors, which is just a native YAML feature, which we used in the example below, which allows you to basically reuse config like this. And I think that solves a lot of headaches as well. But the difference between the two is that the merge key can work across multiple files. So whereas the YAML anchor can only work in that one file, but if you have a lot of repetition in a single file, that solves it. And just by like implementing this anchors, I think we reduced our current YAMLs by half or something. So that's pretty nice. And yeah, I think what's the next slide, Mike? Right, yeah. So this is it from a kind of the DevOps perspective, both from a high-level overview, just how we set things up generally, and the workflows we built around that, and then these three at least challenges that we bumped into, and we hope users, we assume users bump into as well and would like to have an answer to, but all this setting up kind of leads to what Emanuele is about to show us. So what does this mean in practice for a backend engineer? All the work that the DevOps person just did. So with that, I'll just hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Izzy, for the nice overview. Now let's take a look at what developing with Garden on a day-to-day basis means. So I'm going to go through 4 points, which one, we decided to kind of set up the project were very important for our team, and hopefully they will resonate with you too. And after that, they'll demo a very simple workflow. So ideally, as a backend developer, to achieve a smooth and nice development experience, you want to high complexity, unless you need to really deep dive into something specific to your stack. So ideally, I want to just get up in the morning, open my laptop, and start writing code. That's it. When I join a new team or a new company, I want to check out their repo or branch and not worry about what DB do I need to connect to. Is it a local or remote DB? How do I set it? Do I need to run anything else beside the service that I'm working on? Is there anything that depends on my service? And if that's the case, how do I run it? How do I test it? How do I deploy it? Etc. I mean, we've all been there. This is a huge context that you have to load, and you need to keep it in your head and in your documentations, and you have to update it when something changes. And worst of all, you have to destroy the new hires in the first days of the new job. And honestly, it just sucks and doesn't really scale. And I mean, one of the reasons I joined this company was exactly this. In a Garden project, you don't need to load this context altogether unless you need to. And all the dependencies between the modules are codified and visualized in the dashboard, as Eythor showed us earlier. And you can just literally, most of the time, of course, just check out your branch and run Garden deploy, and boom, you're ready to go. And the easiness of this process is what I actually like the most about working with Garden at Garden. And another point that was very important when we were setting up our project was being able to develop and run the code in an isolated, reproducible environment, and which was as close as possible to a production cluster. And again, spent too much time trying to match the different configuration between my locally running service and a remote service that wouldn't have any port open, or maybe some configuration was not valid between the different environments. And it just, the idea that works on my machine, the idea of works on my machine doesn't really apply when you do cloud native development. And that's the reason why at Garden we decided to fully switch to in-cluster development. So each one of us has their own namespaces, and each one of us deploys the full stack. And that includes like all the vault instances, database instrumentation, etc. And that, of course, has several benefits. I mean, you don't need to check if you're developing against a different version of a dependency, for example, or your environment is reproducible in the sense that you want to Garden version your services. That means that, let's say you want to test something that works in how something works in your main branch. You just check out the branch, deploy it, and boom, you have your main branch running on your cluster. Only the service that actually change between the branches will be redeployed and will be retested. So it's easy and fast to switch between branches. And it's also easy to collaborate because you have access to your coworkers' namespaces as well. And you're running on a cluster, which is very important. I mean, of course, there will be differences between your production and dev clusters. I hope there will be differences. But for sure, there will be less differences in that scenario than, let's say, having your 5 services running on your local machine with a bash script that somebody 2 years ago wrote. So, of course, you could also run everything on a local cluster on your laptop, but I mean that comes with its own limitation because laptops are laptops. And third point that I wanted to mention was very important to have a fast feedback loop while developing. We use hot reload quite a bit, and personally, I tend to like to try out ideas while I work on a new endpoint or something. So I'm able to see the changes that it makes super early and super fast. I don't want to rebuild my containers. I don't want to redeploy anything. I just want to see my changes up and running and as fast as possible. And the last point is we want to run integration tests easily and early. And I think this is one of the coolest part of using Garden. Normally, you'd need the entire stack deployed somewhere to run your integration test, or at least a part of it somehow. And that's why normal integration tests are run in CI, right? You have your staging testing environment, and you run the test, your test against that. But yeah, I mean, guess what? You already have that with Garden, right? You are developing against a running cluster. So we write and run a lot of integration tests at Garden, and we usually do it in 2 ways. Garden usually either using Garden Dev and Garden Tests, which will, if something changes, you rerun these commands, or Garden Dev will rerun the test for you automatically. But this usually takes a while because, I mean, again, you have to rebuild all the dependency graphs, so it's not really used while we do hot reloading. Instead, in that scenario, we set up our test in a way that we can shell inside the module where the tests are defined and run them from there. And this is possible because our integration set are set up in a way that we use in our dev cluster the same database for both testing and running the application. And each test suite creates its own temporary schema, populates it with seed data, and clean up itself out afterwards. And we found this to be cheaper than setting up and managing an ADOC integration database instance to only spin up and kill after the integration tests. But yeah, I've been talking quite a lot, so I'm just gonna show you something around now. And so yeah, this is essentially what I do when I turn on my laptop in the morning. I just open my Eythor, and usually I just run Garden deploy. Let's say I'm working on the API service, so I will just hot reload the API, and Garden will do these things. Meanwhile, I will start K9S. K9S is a wonderful tool which we use internally a lot, and I like it because it just gives me a lot of access to logs and give me the possibility to shell into a container very fast, which is what I usually want. And we also run our API on on Express, and we have a tool called SOA, which generates our routes for us. So we have a custom script that checks for any controller changes and regenerates the routes for us. So what happened here with when I run Garden deploy hot API, Garden will go inside the project, check all the dependency. Now this took very little because for demo purposes, I run a deploy before the webinar started, so all the images are cached, so there was not so much to do. But essentially, Garden did a bit of plumbing for me. One thing that I love is that I automatically can get a port forward to my Postgres instance, so I can just connect to my local. I can reconnect. I can just connect to with PostgreSQL to my database, like if it was a local database. He started a dashboard, which gives you an overview of your system and what's there, what has failed. You have the stack graph, and we see all the steps that are needed to build, test, and run your application, and all the dependency between each step. And also gives me like a link to the ingress for the front end and for the backend. So we're gonna hold on to this backend endpoint. I created a demo endpoint that just returns success and some data. So the idea now is that I'm on my Visual Studio Code. I'm doing some refactoring, and I realized that this endpoint should return error and should return some wrong data. So as soon as I press save, the SOADev command will pick up the changes, will regenerate the routes, which Garden will pick up, will resync, will get synced to the API pod, which will restart, and will just update my endpoint. And that's mostly it, essentially. That's how we do a lot of our development. Or at least that's how I do a lot of my development. When we want to run tests, as we said earlier, we have two ways of doing that. You can either run Garden test, which of course will take quite a lot, or you can shell inside a container and just run your own test. And you can run test we run root, which is not gonna take too long. And yeah, this test will essentially create a new schema into the database, populate it with seed data, run the test. I mean, this is like a very simple test, just for demo purposes. And this also now is building a new image because the version of the module has changed while we're doing hot reloading. So we'll now rebuild the image, deploy a test pod from where we run our actual tests. This is succeeded. This will take too long, so I'm gonna kill it. And yeah, that's mostly it, essentially. With this kind of workflow, I mean, this is of course a very simple one where we don't have to do any changes to our database configuration and anything like just crazy, just essentially controller logic. But yeah, for example, if we have to change the database schema, we run the migration, we can just run everything through Garden, and yeah, that works pretty well. So I think I'm just gonna hand it back to AZ.
Yeah, and I'll share my screen again with the slides. Take it to the end. So give me just a minute to get that.
Disable screen sharing.
about so, all right.
Right.
All right,
Thank you.
AC,
Thank you very much.
back to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Emanuele. But I'm gonna risk the webcam. But maybe you could just like let me know if I start lacking. But I'll give it a spin. So yeah, we've seen how the DevOps person, engineer can think about Garden and how a backend developer can think about Garden. So let's look at the front-end developer now. If you could put on the next slide. Yeah, there you go. So yeah, front engineers can use Garden as much or as little as they need, and they can use it to easily develop against different versions of the backend, to manually test in a production-like environment, and to write end-to-end tests. So maybe I'll just show you real quick what it means. This is not going to be an impressive demo by any standards, but just to show you what I mean by as much or as little as they need. So yeah, I'm gonna share my screen real quick. It's this one. And I want to share the entire screen this time around. Right. So, of course, there's the, so as a front developer, I, of course, need my API service and all supporting services, database, and everything running. And for that, we use Garden deploy, as we've seen now a few times. Let me just, I thought this was actually already built, so we'll just give it a few seconds. But yeah, now you see it's building the front end. It's already built the back end, which we also saw a demo of from Emanuele. But the point is, so like the front end is also containerized. It's also running in the cluster. It's a create React app, and we had to. It's a little bit tricky actually to get that to run in a container. So if you have any questions about that, if you're using create React app as well, feel free to like reach out to us on the community Slack. We haven't really, we don't have any like guides or demos on that, but there are a few things you need to get that working. But yeah, so as a front developer, I can have this running in the cluster. I can do everything remotely. I can even configure hot reloading for the front end, so it works just like development locally. Or alternatively, and this is kind of the wow factor, you can just do, oops, better be in the right directory. I can just run the front end locally as I normally would, and this is actually my preferred workflow when I'm working on the front end. So instead of having that, well, it is running in the cluster regardless, but it's also just a very nice developer experience to have this running locally and to get that feedback, to have hot reloading enabled via the local developer server, so you don't have to worry about configuring it through Garden, and that just works. This is, you'll see this is localhost running here, and I have Vim open here. So if I just go ahead and make some changes to this. So this is just, these are the front-end developer workflows that we're used to. It will recompile and it will update immediately. So the point being that you can like use Garden to suit any workflow. The DevOps person can use it to set things up for the team, to enable the team, add supporting services, things like that. The backend developer usually will develop against a remote cluster, as Emanuele showed us, run their tests, their integration tests in the remote environment. Whereas, let me just kill this. Whereas a front developer can just stick to their normal workflows, which is what I prefer to do. I actually tend to do similar to how Emanuele just showed us. I tend to have the API service running in the background. I tend to have Garden running, deploying the API service or other supporting services as I need in hot reload mode. So as I'm kind of iterating on the front end with that running locally, I can, if I want to see, what's going to happen if, oops, forgot I'm using Vim here instead of, see. There you go. should just use the VS Code for this one. Second thought, API. So as I'm developing the front, I still like to make changes to the backend every now and then, just to make sure I got things right. So for instance, the reason it's hot reloading, by the way, right now is because I don't think we're ignoring the Vim swap files that get generated. But let's say I want to see how my front end handles empty data. I can do things like this. So I'll, it will hot reload immediately. So this is kind of part of my workflows when I'm working on the front end. I can do stuff like that. Usually I'm just focused on the front end. I have that running locally. It's a great experience, just like any old front development work. But it's super easy to also make changes to the backend like this. It's not as regular as if when I'm working on the backend, where I might be running integration tests. But like for small tweaks like this, great to have it just running in hot reload mode. And likewise, whoops, stop sharing. And likewise, if I'm working on the front end and someone else has a branch open and I want to try my front end against whatever backend logic is being written there, I'll just switch to, say, Emanuele's branch or Emanuele's PR. I'll do a Garden deploy API on that branch, switch back to my code and restart the front end service. And again, then I have my front end source code calling Emanuele's API service. I can of course also just change the endpoints at the front level, but kind of the the point being that it's super easy to switch between kind of contacts, so to speak, for the front end and develop against different versions of the backend. And also, I think a common workflow for both myself when I'm working on the front end and our other front end developer is that like we've been talking about, all this is still running in a cluster in our own unique host names. So if I am say implementing new designs, I can easily just give that a shot and then just send a link to a running instance of my entire stack, my entire project, to the designer, get their feedback right away, iterate, things like that. And that kind of comes back to this idea of a notion of a production-like preview environments. And that's also definitely a core part of our workflows, both on the front end and back end. So yeah, so the broader point being is, like, as a front developer, you can opt into Garden as much or as little kind of as you need. So there's a lot of flexibility in that, I think. And of course, finally, like we saw with the integration tests earlier, having everything running in your stack, of course, also enables you to write end-to-end tests for the front end. And we have a very minimal end-to-end test suite right now with Cypress. We're still figuring out some things with respect to authentication, but I think it would be very useful once we have that all set up to share that somehow in a form of a guide or a blog post, because I think this is something people struggle with a lot. So an end-to-end testing with Garden and Cypress. But yeah, I think that's not much more to add for the front end, I believe. And yes, just to kind of recap our key workflows. So I guess they would be, at least the way I see it, key workflows, just using the same few simple commands for just about everything. So whether it's CI, whether it's onboarding a new employee, or wake up and code mode, which is just a fancy way of saying, like, I can just get started right away, whether it's on my own code early in the morning or someone else's branch. I think it always, like, having worked in other code bases, switching to, like, whether I'm doing, like, reviewing PRs or just going through difficult rebases, merges, stuff like that. There's always this, where you have to, like, reinstall all the dependencies, remove node modules, what have you. That can always be a bit of a hassle, especially for a young project where you're, like, making changes quite rapidly to kind of the core stuff. But with Garden, I can just check out to basically any old branch. I do a Garden deploy and it just works. So that I am always as depressed by that. Impressed, not depressed. I am always as impressed by that. That's a great experience. In my opinion, it's impressing, not depressing. Another key workflow, just developing and running code in a remote production-like cluster, and kind of as a corollary to that, integration testing in a production-like environment. And note that pre-commit, so not in your CI or staging environment. After you push the GitHub, you can test this as you code and get immediate feedback. And something I like to do there, and I think all of us, which Emanuele showed us, is to have Garden running in hot reload mode, and shell into that container, and then you just you run your integration tests. Something fails, you edit the code, it hot reloads to that running container in a matter of seconds, and you just run the tests again, and you get a super fast feedback loop, considering everything is running in a remote cluster and you have your entire stack somewhat stood up. And finally, using kind of the fact that every developer can have their own namespace and host names, and so does every CI run or staging environments, demo environments. The fact that you have all these preview environments of your project in different states on different branches, that's actually also like a key part of our workflows, and something we use a lot to share our work with others, to share with designers, to debug, all those things. So and do manual testing, of course. It's very nice to get a PR and just a link where you can click into the entire world that you're reviewing and press all the buttons and make sure everything adds up. So that's something like I think a very big value prop of Gardens.
All right, awesome. So yeah, I think we're on to Q&A, and I will say, in case any of you are listening to this in the background, there's been quite some back and forth going on in the chat, some interesting things being covered, and you can still check that out if you come back to watch the recording later. Just wanted to point that out before we get into questions here. And so yeah, let's go through it. Let me pull up my list. And okay, yeah, so we had a few different questions kind of about the clusters we're using, like how big they are, what it takes to maintain them, costs, things like that. And so yeah, AC, maybe you just want to give the overview of our clusters in terms of, again, size of development staging clusters and what we do to keep when it comes to upkeep, and the costs for each of the clusters too. Right.
That's a good question. So I have some notes on the topic. Just give me one second. Yeah. So the both clusters. So yeah, I mentioned we have a developer cluster running on Google Cloud Platform, and our staging on Amazon's, and both have 3 nodes or 3 workers. They're similar size. The GCP one has the N1 standard 4 machine type, and the EKS one has EKS one has M4 large. We have namespaces for other developers in the GCP one, plus like some things we're trying out, whereas the staging one runs the staging environment, the demo environment, and then on every push to GitHub, it runs a dedicated like CI branch where we'll like run the tests in a dedicated namespace, and then it will tear that down once that's done, and that's worked fine for us in terms of maintenance. Not much what we had to do, in particular since switching to Canonical. So previously we had to like clean up the registry every now and then, but now that's not really a problem. And we use again Terraform to stand everything up. So there's not much there really. It is quite pain-free, to be honest. Of course, the initial work of setting up of all the Terraform files, that was quite a project, but now that it's there, not a lot of maintenance. And you mentioned costs as well, did you?
Yeah. There was a question about what our costs are for the development.
Yeah, I can happily answer that. So on GCP, I think it's relatively cheap. We're paying around 400 euros per month on GCP, and anywhere between 250 and 350 on AWS. And we pay a bit more on AWS because we have other compute there as well. We're using, for instance, RDS. I didn't mention that, but I talked about how in our development environments we have Postgres as a database for each developer, but then we have in the staging environment we just have a fixed RDS database instance that we don't clean out or tear down. It stays there. So that incurs some costs and some other compute, but the EKS part is between 250 and 350 euros.
All right, cool. So other questions. Okay, yeah, there was a question about what we're using for CI right now and whether there's one in particular that you have to use with Garden. And
no, nothing of that sort really. I mean, like I showed you earlier and talked about earlier, like it's this concept of, if you have Garden installed, you can run it in pretty much any context. Of course, you have to authenticate against the cluster Garden is running against, but you can use Garden in Circle CI, in Jenkins, Travis, what have you. If you have something like internal, you can use that there as well. We also have you can download from Docker Hub or pull from Docker Hub like Garden images that have Garden installed, which makes it and some like utility tools for both GCP and AWS. It makes it super easy to run in CI. So just whatever floats your boat. We use Circle CI. It's fine, and yeah.
All right, cool. There was also a question around what are some things that you'd like to add that you think are missing right now based on your own experience. And so you mentioned, Issy, in your first section, the migration piece, but curious if there's anything else that comes to mind.
Good question. Emanuele, do you have thoughts on this one? It's a very good question.
It's a very good question. I think
if you could have anything.
Well, I have to say I'm pretty happy with our setup, but I think one user case that I think needs a bit more refining is the kind of debugging, remote debugging use case, which we are looking now to integrate maybe other tools like telepresence or and using it together with Garden. Right now, the setup that we have is quite rudimental. It kind of works, but we could spend a bit more time on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a good point. A good point you made as well. Like you showed, you use K9S, right? We mentioned telepresence just now. I think it just goes to show that the Garden can work with a lot of other tools. So like there's nothing right or wrong in that. So if there are tools like that make things even easier for you, it's often the case that it's very easy to integrate it with Garden. And I think one thing that springs to my mind is we talked about how we mentioned the thing with the migration. It's not that big of a deal in my opinion. Once you got it working, I haven't really thought about it since. But we also talked about how we shell into a container to run integration tests while we hot reload. Might be nice to have more of a Garden native way to do that, like hot reloadable integration tests where you can run tests without having to rebuild everything. I think that would be super cool. But I think and I'd give this advice to everyone. We invested a lot in the developer experience early on. I think most of those, like we had like a list of issues on GitHub, like a wish list of things we want to improve. I think most of those we improved kind of not by making changes to Garden core per se, but just by changing how we use it or fixing how we use that. And I think we actually touched on some of those today. For instance, the I don't remember if migrations were on the list, but definitely the thing about sharing types between API and frontend that we solved with, or that we're solving with multi-stage builds now, and some other things. And kind of on topic, a thing I would, since I'm giving advice, I wish we'd invested more in earlier is probably better logging and tracing. You saw how we're pulling Jaeger in there now, and that's for a reason. It's there are a few moving parts to the whole thing, so I believe it's like very important to invest in that from the start, because it just saves you so much time spent in debugging and tracing through what's going on in your system. So and I wonder if Garden, for instance, if we should have plugins to enable that, or help users get started with these kind of tools that might be useful as well.
All right, cool. So that was it for questions. We're also coming up on the end of the hour. And so if there's anything else that either of you two want to say, I'll give you the stage once more. Otherwise, I can wrap things up.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, just really, really happy and excited to be able to talk about Garden as a user, to be a heavy Garden user right now. And, you know, we've gotten a lot of feedback from the community channel, obviously throughout the years, and you know, being a user puts that all in perspective, and you know, makes us work that much harder towards just making this a great user experience for everyone, for ourselves and everyone else, of course. And if there's anything that was unclear in this talk, or any open questions, by all means, just reach out either on our Slack or through other channels. So we'd be happy to help out with that.
Yeah, we value feedback a lot. So please, especially if you find a bug, or if there's something that doesn't quite sounds right, and or something is not very well documented, we really need this kind of feedback. So just reach out, please.
Cool. Yeah, and I'll say, if you're not already in the Slack channel, you can go to chat.garden.io, and that'll redirect you to the registration page to get into the Slack channel. So with that, yeah, go ahead and wrap things up. So if you want to be informed of future webinars and product releases and things like that, we have a monthly newsletter. You can subscribe on the website. In the footer, there's a field where you can give us your email address. If you want to talk about Garden Enterprise, set up time to learn more about it, how it might apply to what you're doing, you can go to garden.io/contact, and we'll get back to you quickly. Everyone who registered will get an email with the webinar recording the next 24 hours or so, and so look out for that. And lastly, we are hiring, and so if you liked hearing about what we're doing with Garden, think you want to get involved, you can go to join.garden.io, and it would be great to hear from you. So that's everything. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you to our presenters. You guys did a great job. And hopefully we'll see you at the next one. Have a good night, everyone. Bye-bye.